we're going to be talking about the qualities of a godly leader. A godly leader. Now, when I learned a few weeks ago that Father's Day was falling during this series, I considered taking a week off of the series and doing one specifically for men, like I did for the ladies, the lasting legacy, if you remember that, right? We talked about all the ladies in the Bible. Well, I think that the title or the ideas of what we're going to be talking about today very much match with a Father's Day message. While everyone is a leader, all of us in here are leaders, right? Today I want to focus specifically on the men. Now, that's not to say that all of us can't glean something from this, because we all can, because we're all leaders in one shape or another. So we're going to be really honoring the men today. We're going to be looking at Ezra chapter 7 and 8. And we're also going to be looking at Nehemiah chapters 5 and 10. And first what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to explain the text. I'm going to explain what's going on in Ezra's chapter 7 and 8. And Nehemiah chapters 5 and 10. And then after we go through that text, then I have three things for you, because that's what a pastor does. I have three things for you, three character qualities of a godly leader as we see them in the books that we're covering today. Okay? I'm going to go ahead and pray real quick, and then we'll go ahead and get into the word this morning. So Father, I just pray that you would have your way, Lord, with your word today, Lord. This isn't my word, Lord. It's me giving it, Lord, but it's you that inspired it, you that wrote it, Lord, that worked through men, and you wrote your word out. And so, Lord, I pray that we would glean something important from your word today, Father. And we pray these things in your name. Amen. Now, last week I talked about the Jewish people having been defeated in battle by the Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar. Now, most people at that time were taken into captivity. They were taken into slavery. And about 70 years passed before the King Cyrus, the guy I've been talking about, Artaxerxes, came to the throne. Okay? Thankfully, King Cyrus looked favorably upon the Jewish people and gave them permission to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild the city walls and the temple. There were three separate trips that happened. One was from a guy named Zerubbabel, one was from Ezra, and one was from Nehemiah. And they all had different tasks to accomplish. And as we go forward in this series, we'll talk about what those tasks were. All right, so picking up this week in Ezra chapter 7, some time now had passed since King Artaxerxes, King Cyrus, had made that decree, okay, that the Jewish people could leave Babylon and return to Judah. All right, and so some time had passed, and that's where we pick up Ezra chapter 7, verse 1. Starting in verse 1, I'll show the at the end, okay? I got a funny Father's Day video for you, but I'll show it at the end. So here we go. Ezra chapter 7, verse 1, and then verse 8 through 10, okay? Because in between verse 1 and verse 8, there's a list of names, okay, that I'm not going to take time to read, okay? 7:1. Now after these things, in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, there went up Ezra, son of Sariah, son of Azariah, son of him, and then it keeps on, son of so on and so forth, on back through the generations. Then we pick up at verse 8. He came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, this is Ezra, which was in the 7th year of the king. For on the first of the month, he began to go up from Babylon, and on the first of the 5th month, he came to Jerusalem. So on the 1st month, he left Babylon. On the 5th month, he arrived in Jerusalem, because the good hand of his God was upon him. For Ezra had his heart set to study the law of the Lord and to practice it, and to teach its statutes and ordinances in Israel. And we're going to come back to that at the end. So chapter 7 opens up with Ezra leaving Babylon and returning to Jerusalem. Throughout these verses, there are a lot of names mentioned, as I said, which I did not take the time to read. However, beginning in verse 11 of Ezra chapter 7, we began to read the written decree that King Cyrus gave Ezra. The written decree functioned as a passport for Ezra and those that were traveling with him. And it was instructions also to the people that Ezra would come across as he made the journey from Babylon to Jerusalem. And also, as a quick plug for the videos that I put out on Thursdays on YouTube, our Facebook, and so on and so forth, I do take the time to read all of it. I read all of Ezra chapter 7, chapter 8, Nehemiah 5, Nehemiah 10. So if you want to hear the whole thing and read along with me, you can look those up, and I can help you if you don't know how. So we're going to pick it up in Ezra chapter 7, verse 12 to 13. Okay, here we go. Ezra chapter 7, verse 12 to 13. And this is the king, Cyrus, the written decree that he gives Ezra and the people following with him. Okay? Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, the scribe of the law of the God of heaven, perfect peace. And now I have issued a decree that any of the people of Israel and their priests and the Levites in my kingdom who are willing to go to Jerusalem may go with you. So the king issues a decree that Ezra and anyone who wants to go can make their way from Babylon to Jerusalem. Now, why was it important for Ezra to have this document with him? It's important to understand that. Why was it important that he and the countless tens of thousands that followed him have this decree from the king? It mattered because Ezra, along with all the people that were going to be going with him, were slaves. They were indentured servants, as it were. Their country, Judah, had been defeated in battle about 70 years prior, like we talked about last week. And after that battle, the people that lived in Judah, that lived in the city of Jerusalem, were deported and forced to abandon their land to move to Babylon. The Jewish people were then not allowed to go back to their homeland, especially with the intent of rebuilding. Most kings would be very afraid of that, to have these conscripted servants go back with the intent of rebuilding their city. Okay? But this written decree gave Ezra and those people following him permission to do that. But the king didn't just simply sign off on Ezra and the people's ability to travel. He went even further than that. Verse 14 and 15, this is still the written decree from the king. Forasmuch as you are sent by the king and his 7 counselors to inquire concerning Judah and Jerusalem, according to the law of your God, which is in your hand, and bring the silver and gold, which the king and his counselors have freely offered to the God of Israel, who's dwelling in Jerusalem. So not only did King Cyrus give Ezra the freedom to travel, say, hey, yep, you can go, and bring along as many people as he wanted, but the king loaded them down with lots and lots of money. Lots of money. The king offered to pay for the reconstruction efforts back in Judah. That's significant. King Cyrus goes on to say in Ezra verse 18, here we go, and the king says to Ezra, right here, he says, whatever seems good to you and your brothers, do with the rest of the silver and gold, you may do according to the will of your God. What the king is saying here is, hey, the money that I gave you, spend the money in whatever way you think might be the best. He obviously greatly trusted Ezra. He trusted him a lot. And we'll talk again more about that later. The king's decree in Ezra chapter 7 ends with instructions to the leaders of the towns that they will be going through. So imagine this. Imagine if you and I were to set out from Illinois to California. Okay? Well, this written decree would give us permission to go to California, but it would also tell all of the leaders in the towns that we would go through from here to California, hey, listen, when Ezra and his people pass through your town, so when we come to Boise, Idaho, or when we come to LA, or when we go to any of those cities, hey, you are to help Ezra. You are to support him with silver, gold, with goods, with people. You are to support Ezra as he passes through your town. Obviously, the king, again, had great trust in Ezra and Ezra's wisdom on how to handle all of these things. Okay? So here we go. Now, there is one interesting thing. Why would the king do this? Why would the king of a country who has defeated Judah, why would he all of a sudden turn to Ezra and say, yes, go back to your homeland, rebuild your temple, rebuild the walls, and do it. And matter of fact, I'll pay for it. Right? It's like the best friend you can have, right? Go ahead and go back, and I will pay for it. I think in verse 23, here we go, I'm going to skip that one. Verse 23, I think it explains why the king did this. It says this is the king. Whatever is commanded by the God of heaven, let it be done with zeal for the house of the God of heaven, so that there will not be wrath, listen, so that there will not be wrath against the kingdom of the king and his sons. I would imagine that King Cyrus knew the reputation of the God of Ezra. These stories had been passed down throughout the ages, all the way back to when Egypt was basically ruined as a nation, because Pharaoh crossed the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And obviously, King Artaxerxes knew these stories, and not only that, he believed them. Else he wouldn't have said, so that there will not be wrath against the kingdom of the king and against his sons. So even though King Cyrus wasn't a godly man per se, he was smart enough to know you don't cross the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I think that was the king's main motivation for not only allowing the people to go back, but also for paying for everything. Okay? Remember in Isaiah, and we talked about this last week, the prophet Isaiah actually predicted that this would happen hundreds of years before. Okay? Isaiah wrote this in Isaiah 44:28. It is I who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will perform all of my desires. And he will declare of Jerusalem, she will be built. And of the temple, your foundation will be laid. Now that was written hundreds of years before King Cyrus ever existed. And so it wouldn't surprise me if King Cyrus, through his own scribes and such, knew of these written decrees, knew of these prophecies that had been handed down for hundreds of years. And King Cyrus didn't want to become the next Egypt. He didn't want to become the next Pharaoh and cross the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So that's chapter 7. Let's keep moving to chapter 8 here. The first 20 verses of Ezra chapter 8 are just a list of people and families that followed Ezra. That's it. That's pretty simple, right? But there is one point in this list, in verse 15, which I'll read, when Ezra discovers, as he's listing all of the people that came with him, something important. And it's verse 15. It says this. Now, this is Ezra. Now, as I assembled them, all the people, at the river that runs to Ahava, where we camped for 3 days. Now remember, they're on their way from Babylon to Jerusalem. And when I observed the people and the priests, I did not find any Levites there. I'm pointing this verse out because it's important to know who the Levites were. Why did Ezra care if there were no Levites in the group that were following him? Why would he care about that? I'll talk about that in a little bit. So up to verse 20, as I said a moment ago, it's kind of just listing all the families, aside for verse 15 here, where we realize there's no Levites, okay, that left Babylon with Ezra. So we'll pick up Ezra chapter 8 in verse 21. Here we go, okay? Ezra chapter 8, verse 21 to 23. And we're just continuing the story here. As I said, the first part is just going through the text, and then we'll talk about application and a few, okay? So here we go. So Ezra arrives in the vicinity of Jerusalem. They've made this long trip. They have lots of money. They have lots of responsibility, okay? And so then they arrive in the vicinity of Jerusalem, and then Ezra says this, "Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river of Ahava, that we might humble ourselves before our God to seek from him a safe journey for us, our little ones, and our possessions. For I was ashamed to request from the king's troops and horsemen to protect us from the enemy on the way, because we had said to the king, the hand of our God is favorably disposed to all of us who seek him, but his power and anger are against all those who forsake him. So we fasted and sought our God concerning this matter," and I love this part, "and he listened to our entreaty." So as I said, Ezra arrives in the vicinity of Jerusalem, takes inventory of everyone with him, and then he declares a fast. To me, it's interesting to note why he declared the fast, because he says why. Ezra says that he did not ask King Cyrus to send any soldiers with them, because that would make God look bad. Think about it for a moment. God moves on the heart of King Artaxerxes, the King Cyrus, who was not a godly man. So the king gives Ezra, tens of thousands of other people, permission to go and rebuild the temple. For Ezra, asking for soldiers to protect them would indicate that their God will not protect them. Now, I'm sure that the king would have sent soldiers, no big deal. I'm sure that he would have sent soldiers. But Ezra says, and he says, Ezra was ashamed to request soldiers. To me, and I could be wrong, this is my idea here, this is just a glimpse into the humanity of Ezra. It doesn't appear as though the Lord instructed Ezra not to ask for protection, or Ezra wouldn't say, I was ashamed. I understand why Ezra didn't ask. You know, in his mind, asking for protection for the journey would have made the Lord look weak. Yet, from all accounts, I think it's pretty clear that King Cyrus did not think Ezra's God was weak. King Cyrus knew the power of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But regardless, in order to make sure everything's okay, Ezra declares a fast. And he asked for the protection of the Lord. And I love verse 23 where it says, "We fasted and sought our God concerning this matter, and he listened to our entreaty." God answered their prayers. He was faithful in protecting his people. The remainder of Ezra chapter 8, as we're going through the story, details how then Ezra took a lot of the gold that he had and silver and other goods, and he gave them to the Levites. Remember when I said a few minutes ago that when Ezra first did a population count, he noticed that there weren't any Levites? Well, he had sent for some, okay? And so then Ezra handed over all of this gold and silver and such to the Levites, because here's why that was important. It was the Levites' job to care for the house of the Lord. Without any Levites there, they would get all the way to Jerusalem, having the temple be rebuilt, but there would be nobody there to actually care for it. And that is why it was important to have the Levites there. So Ezra entrusted the Levites with all of this gold and silver and had them count it and set it aside for different projects. They were kind of the administrators or the secretaries, making sure that each project had its own funding, and that's important. And so then the end of chapter 8 says that Ezra had a number of scribes and priests also go out and deliver the king's edict to the neighboring towns and the cities. Verse 36 says this, speaking of going out to the neighboring towns and cities, then they delivered the king's edicts to the king's satraps and governors in the provinces beyond the river, and then they supported the people in the house of God. So these towns, remember, if we stop by Boise, Idaho, we stop by Duluth, Montana, or wherever we going on our way to, is that Montana? Anyway, sorry. On our way to California, all these people decided, they followed the king's orders, and they helped out Ezra on his way. Okay, so that's Ezra. That's pretty much Ezra chapter 8. That's the end of Ezra chapter 8. Now let's hit Nehemiah chapter 5 and 10, and then we'll recap everything, okay? And then we'll get into application. Nehemiah chapter 5 is where we turn to next. Now, to kind of lay some groundwork here, because I didn't do it well last week, okay, for the book of Nehemiah, it's important to understand a few things. And hopefully I'll explain it better this week, okay? You'll tell me if I don't, all right? So, because these books can be somewhat confusing because there's just so much history, okay? So I'm going to take a little time to explain the idea behind the book of Nehemiah, because it's a little bit different than Ezra. All right, so first we have, I mentioned before, a long time ago, before this, the Jewish people leaving Egypt under Moses, right? Entering the promised land. And then we have the time of the judges, guys like Samson and so on. And then after that, we have the time of the kings. King David, King Solomon, King Jeroboam, so on and so forth. Okay, well, after that period of time, or kind of in the middle of that period of time, Israel, the nation, had a civil war. The people were warring against one another, and the nation was divided into two nations. Okay? Eventually, these nations, Judah and Israel, went to war with foreign countries like Babylon. And their nations, Judah and Israel, were destroyed. Okay? So first, the northern Jewish kingdom of Israel was destroyed, and then the southern Jewish kingdom of Judah was destroyed. And that's where we're talking about now in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, is the southern kingdom of Judah. And the city of Jerusalem, where all this has taken place, was in the southern kingdom of Judah. Okay? It had been destroyed by the Babylonians, and the temple of Solomon, the famous temple of Solomon, had been destroyed. Okay? When the Jews were then, after they were defeated, they were deported to Babylon. After the Jews got in a fight with the Babylonians in Judah, they were deported. And then, as what happens often, the people that were deported over to Babylon began to make homes for themselves. They began to settle in. They began to kind of get ingrained in the society over there. And actually, during this time, that around this takes place, we have actually some famous names from the Bible that rose to prominence in Babylonian society. People like Daniel from the book of Daniel, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They became leaders in Babylon. Also, another famous one is Esther. Esther actually became a queen in one of the provinces of Babylon. Thankfully, though, God always leaves a remnant of people that don't forget his word. And some of the ones that I mentioned here were some of those remnant, right? So it's been 70 years of captivity in Babylon, and finally the Jewish people were given opportunity to return to their homeland, the promised land, right, that God had promised Abraham so long ago. And out of an estimated 2 or 3 million Jews that had been deported from Judah to Babylon, only about 50,000 returned. That's something like 2%. But they did return, those 50,000. And in the days of Ezra, they rebuilt the temple. Okay, so in the days of Ezra, they rebuilt the temple, and Ezra laid a spiritual foundation. Okay, once again, for Israel to start worshiping the Lord. The book of Nehemiah begins about 15 years after the book of Ezra ends. Okay? So the book of Nehemiah, what we're in now, it starts about 15 years after the book of Ezra ends. The temple had been rebuilt, but the walls were still in crumble. So the temples were built, Ezra did that, but the walls were still in crumble. And that's where we pick up the book of Nehemiah, chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. Here we go, Nehemiah. Now there was a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish brothers. For there were those who said, "We, our sons and our daughters are many. Therefore, let us eat grain that we may eat and live." There were others who said, "We are mortgaging our fields and our vineyards and our houses that we might get grain because of the famine." Now, so the people who were helping Nehemiah rebuild the wall began to complain. But they had a legitimate complaint this time. Apparently, there was a famine in the land at the time while they were trying to rebuild the wall. And so the workers were not able to properly feed their families. This type of strife is not good for the morale of the people. I think we probably know that, right? If I can't feed my family, I'm going to have a hard time putting in a good day's work to concentrate on what I'm supposed to be doing. To be honest, it had the potential to stop the rebuilding of the wall pretty quickly. So Nehemiah had to deal with this situation, and quickly, if Nehemiah wanted the construction of the wall to continue. So we'll pick up chapter 5 again in verse 6. Here we go. 6 to 8. This is Nehemiah speaking. "Then I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. I consulted with myself." I love that. "I consulted with myself and contended with the nobles and the rulers and said to them, 'You are exacting usury from your brothers,' basically. 'Therefore, I held a great assembly against them. And I said to them, we, according to our ability, have redeemed our Jewish brothers who were sold to the nations. Now would you even sell your brothers that they may be sold to us?' Then they were silent and could not find a word to say." So Nehemiah got wind that the wealthy people among those who went back, right, were charging large amounts of interest for loans. They were loaning the poor people money, but charging large amounts of interest. And not only that, but the wealthy would actually take the sons and daughters of their fellow Jewish brothers and sisters as collateral for these loans. That is terrible. I just can't imagine that. And so Nehemiah goes to these wealthy people and said, basically, listen, cut it out. You need to stop this. Think about what these foreign nations did to us, and now you're doing the same thing to your own people. And he gave them a good what for, Nehemiah did. Thankfully, the wealthy people in the area understood the error of their ways, and they agreed to do as Nehemiah said. Now, there's a reason they agreed to do what Nehemiah said, and we'll get into that at the end. They obviously had respect for Nehemiah, okay? And we'll get into that in a few moments. So verse 12, okay, here we got Nehemiah 5:12. This is the wealthy people responding to Nehemiah. Then they said, we will give it back and will require nothing from them. We will do exactly as you say. So I called the priests and took an oath from them that they would do according to this promise. So after confronting the people, Nehemiah gives them an example as we keep going down in the book of Nehemiah chapter 5 of how he is practicing what he preaches. Nehemiah is not just giving them instructions, but he's saying, listen, I'm doing the same thing. So in verse 14, Nehemiah gives them that example. And his example is this, that he has never once taken what is called the governor's food allowance. Basically, here's how that works. Because Jerusalem is a territory of Babylon, right? And Nehemiah is in charge of that area. Nehemiah was given a food allowance to eat every day. Now, you can imagine this wasn't rations. He was given a large amount of food to eat every day and wine to drink. And Nehemiah is sitting here saying that never once since arriving has he ever relied on that food allowance. Never once has he done it. He is trying to, because how could he feast like literally a king while those that are under his care are suffering from a famine? So Nehemiah kind of gives the nobles that example, okay? So that's kind of Nehemiah chapter 5. That's kind of all of it here. And then we move on to Nehemiah chapter 10, and then we're almost done going through these books. And then we'll get into application. So moving on to Nehemiah chapter 10, the last chapter we're covering today. So between Nehemiah's chapter 5 and 10, the wall is finally built. Hooray. Right? It's built. Nehemiah does his job. He builds the wall. Nehemiah and the people of Israel, or at least the ones that returned, are elated. It's sort of, imagine this, a revival of sorts. The people are thankful to the Lord for allowing the wall to be finished. Nehemiah then calls them all together, and they draft a document and enter into a new covenant with the Lord of sorts. And basically what they're doing is they're reaffirming their dedication to the Lord. Now, in their reaffirming their dedication to the Lord, they do a couple important things that had gotten them into trouble before. One, they agreed to not marry people of foreign nations, because that always got them into trouble. They would marry their sons and daughters to the nations that surrounded that area, and then eventually they would start worshiping false gods. So in this covenant, they agreed to not do that, to not marry their sons and daughters off to foreign people. That's number one. The second thing that they put in the covenant to do is to make sure to always take care of the house of the Lord. When the Israelites first entered the promised land, God had warned them not to marry the people who worship false gods, and they ignored that, of course. A few generations later, that's the main reason why Israel and Judah were defeated in battle, because they were fighting amongst themselves. They made shrines and all sorts of things to false gods, so they're saying that's no longer going to happen, and then they make a promise to take care of the temple by giving a portion of their goods and money to help pay the priests, whose job it is to take care of the temple. I'll let that speak for itself. So Nehemiah chapter 10 ends with details about how the priests will continue to care for the temple. Do you remember, this isn't in my notes, but do you remember there's a story I talked about not too long ago with Eli the priest, and it's the story of Hannah, and how Hannah brings, of course, thank you, how Hannah brings Samuel to Eli the priest. At the time, it was Eli's job to care for the temple, except Eli's own boys were not good. Not good. And Eli knew if he left the care of the temple to his boys, the temple would fall into disrepair, so on and so forth. So he gets Samuel then to take care of the temple. Taking care of the temple is important. Taking care of the temple, the Bible talks about how our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit, but also in a more practical and real sense, according to this, taking care of our temple, our house, is important. And it's important that we are good stewards of what the Lord has given us. All right, so let's recap, and then we'll get on to applying the stories that we just went through. So Ezra 7 and 8 are all about Ezra and company leaving Babylon to go to Jerusalem to build the temple. King Cyrus sends with them a decree that instructs other towns and such to help them, and they do. Ezra organizes all of the people and begins to organize the reconstruction efforts. Nehemiah 5 and 10 detail the problems going on with the rebuilding of the walls. Nehemiah rebukes the wealthy people for taking advantage of the workers. And finally, the people reconsecrate themselves to the Lord because the walls have been built. Okay, and they agree to follow the law of Moses once again. So throughout these 4 chapters, we see many, many instances where Ezra and Nehemiah are showing strong leadership skills. In the area of administration, they're providing good examples to others, and they're not being afraid to correct something when a situation calls for it. And all these are good examples of godly leadership from what we can learn from Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay? And so when I say the word leader, because we're talking about godly leaders, what am I referring to when I say the word leader? I think defining the word leader is important because I would venture to say, even though I said some before, not everyone here thinks they're a leader of something, but you are. Since today we're focusing on the men, being a godly man and being a godly leader are one and the same. Any situation in which someone is looking to you as an example or relying on you in some way, you are a leader. Often men think that a leader is someone like your boss at work or someone that you answer to in some area of your life, and that's true. But being a leader is much wider than that. If you're married, then you're a leader. Even if you're still young, but you have younger siblings, you're a leader. Your siblings are looking to you as an example, okay? Pretty much everyone in this room has some area in their life where they're a leader in some way, shape, or form. So understand, when I say the word leader, I'm talking to you, not somebody else. We all have areas that we lead. So if I went around the room and we all listed qualities of a godly leader, each of us would probably list something different that is important to us. The subject of godly leadership, as I said, is very wide-ranging, and we can look to a number of men and women in the Bible to find examples of godly leadership. Naturally, there are many qualities of a godly leader that can be talked about. Today, we're focusing on our text in Ezra and Nehemiah. And to be honest, my issue when coming up with the traits of a godly leader was that I found so many. And obviously, we don't have the time to go through, tons of leader qualities. So what I did was I picked three. I picked three things that I see in Ezra and Nehemiah that I think that can really, really apply to us. Okay, here they are. Of course. Can you get it back to, Josh, to the... The godly leader is trustworthy, sets the example, and speaks the truth. Okay, so Ezra and Nehemiah, so these are the three qualities I see in Ezra and Nehemiah. Number one, they're trustworthy. They're trustworthy. The king trusted them, the people trusted them, so on and so forth. Number two is a godly leader leads by example. And number three, a godly leader speaks the truth in love. So let's go over the first one. How a godly leader, thank you, Josh, how a godly leader is trustworthy. Okay? So here we go. And this is found in Ezra 7, 17 and 18. It says this, and this is the king speaking. With this money, therefore, you shall diligently buy bulls, rams, and lambs with their grain offerings and their drink offerings, and offer them on the altar of the house of your God, which is in Jerusalem. Whatever seems good to you and to your brothers, do it with the rest of the silver and gold, and you may do so according to the will of your God. So consider for a moment the amount of trust that the king had to have in Ezra in order to trust him with all of this money. I mean, it was lots of money. And all the resources that he gave him. Imagine the amount of money and goods that would be required to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the walls, to rebuild everything they needed to rebuild, and for people to also settle in that area. This was not a small project. And the king would be nowhere around to see how it's going. Right? I'm sure he had his people reporting back to him, but he obviously trusted Ezra because Ezra showed himself trustworthy. He proved himself to the king and to the people who served under his leadership. The king trusted that Ezra would make good decisions and use the money wisely, to be a good steward of what the king had donated. The king also trusted that Ezra would keep his word. He would keep his word. If we want to be a godly leader, if I do, if you do, we must be trustworthy. Luke 16:10 says that he who is faithful in very little is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in very little is unrighteous in very much. Now, this verse is speaking specifically about money, but the principle is true regardless. and especially when it comes to money. We have to be responsible and trustworthy in our everyday lives and in our day-to-day decisions. Whether you're leading people at work, or you're at home, or wherever people rely on you, your word must mean something. If you say something is so, it should be so. There should be very few times ever where, well, oops. It happens, we all make mistakes, but for the most part, our word must mean our word. Number 2, a godly leader leads by example. A godly leader leads by example. Ezra chapter 7, verse 10. So let me back up a little bit. So in Nehemiah chapter 5, verse 14, Nehemiah talks about not allowing himself the governor's daily allowance of food, right? He talks about that. I mentioned it earlier, but Nehemiah refused to be treated any different than the people who were working on the wall. And I had mentioned that. Matter of fact, verse 16 says that Nehemiah himself was helping to build the wall along with the others. Now, Nehemiah didn't have to do that. I'm gonna go to this. Here we go. Nehemiah didn't have to help build the wall. How many knows, if you ever worked for anybody in any industry really, where the boss just kind of sits in his office and doesn't do much, right? That's not what Nehemiah was all about, right? That's not what Nehemiah was all about. So, you know what? I think I mixed these around a little bit, but that's okay. So a godly leader leads by example, and Nehemiah was a good example of that by working on the wall with everyone else. Okay? And then let's go ahead and go to the third one. A godly leader speaks the truth in love. A godly leader speaks the truth in love. And this is the last one that we're going to cover today. So Ezra and Nehemiah both face situations in which kind of people get out of line. People do something that they shouldn't do. And a good example is in Nehemiah chapter 5, when Nehemiah finds out that the wealthy are putting the undue burden. We talked about that on the poor people. Nehemiah could have ignored the situation, not wanting to upset all those that have the money, because everyone who has the money is kind of what makes the world go round, as it were. And so then it's difficult to then upset those people. But Nehemiah did not do that. Nehemiah made sure that he went to the landowners and he told them, hey, you need to cut this out. So godly leaders, you and I, must be willing to speak the truth in love. For some people, they would rather cut their arm off than have to get into a confrontational situation. And for others, they don't mind confrontational situations, but they surely don't do it in love. You know what I'm saying? And so there is a good balance that you and I must follow when speaking the truth in love. Let's talk about Ephesians for a moment, because I have down here in Ephesians, and you can turn to it right here. I'm going to go forward a little bit because we're doing okay on time. So, a godly leader speaks the truth in love. Ephesians 4:14-16. It says this: as a result, we are no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves, carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men and the craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in all aspects of Him who is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body, being fitted and held together by what every joint supplies, according to the proper working of each individual part, it causes the growth of the body for the building of itself. So what Paul here is talking about is specifically proper Christian doctrine and Christian maturity. And he's telling the people right here that you have to be honest with each other, to be careful of false teaching, to speak the truth in love to one another. And as I said, we all know those that speak without caring what anybody think. That is not speaking the truth in love. When we do